I'll just start the intro, and then when he gets here, I'll turn it in. All right. So I think we're going to have a few more people still making their way up and navigating the elevators and so on. So, but we'll get going, and we should be joined in a few minutes as well by Raj Shah, the head of the Rockefeller Foundation, to say a few words too. But I will begin with just an overview of what we're going to talk about today and our panel. So thank you first to all of you for coming today and for your interest in this topic. And a particular thank you to the Rockefeller Foundation for hosting us today in their lovely space. Thank you to Sunday and to Catherine. I want everyone to also, I want to give a quick shout out to Catherine Bertini, who as a Rockefeller Fellow has been looking into humanitarian reform issues and just published a fantastic paper on driving change within the UN system, which is excellent and you should all read. So today we're going to talk about the issue of power in the humanitarian system. And this is something that it's very important. We all sort of intuitively recognize that it's an issue and a constraint on reform, but we rarely talk explicitly about power and power imbalances. We talk a lot about standards, and we talk a lot about technical issues, and we talk a lot about best practices, and that hasn't gotten us far enough in terms of humanitarian change. And so CJD has an ongoing research initiative now. The Center for Global Development has an ongoing research initiative now that looks at humanitarian reform through the lens of power and incentives that drive humanitarian behavior. And so the discussion today will look at a few different dimensions of that. I want to give a little bit of an overview of some of our research and of a new paper that we've just published that you should all have on your chairs, and then we'll turn to our fantastic panel to explore some of these issues of power and incentives in humanitarian practice. And we've been joined by Raj. Raj, did you want to say a couple of words? I don't want to put you on the spot. I can keep going too, but please.
Okay. I'll just, hi.
Hi, good.
How are you? Good, welcome. Well, I saw so many familiar names, hi Catherine, on the list that I just wanted to come up and say welcome, and I feel like CJD is a natural partner and extension of our intentions and our work, so welcome to the Rockefeller Foundation, and I wish you the best of luck with this meeting and this engagement. We have a super active week this week at the General Assembly, and we're, amongst other things, announcing a major effort to bring data science and predictive analytics to the effort to reduce child and maternal deaths around the world, which we're launching on Wednesday, and some work on ending energy poverty, which we're also, when is that happening?
Thursday.
That's on Thursday morning. In this past weekend, we had an effort called 17 Rooms to accelerate efforts against achieving the global goals overall. This area of work around, I hope you're talking about reimagining humanitarian action, which would be both what you're immensely qualified to do and the rationale for this gathering is just really important to us. And Catherine has been a fellow working on helping us think through how to contribute to that effort. And so whatever ideas you come up with, we hope we will get a glimpse of that and get a chance to support taking it forward.
Great.
Okay?
Thanks so much.
So thanks very much. And I may loiter for a little
Please
bit
do,
if that's
yes,
okay. Yeah,
of
okay,
course.
Great. All right, thank you.
And thanks, Raj. So the research that CJD has been working on in this initiative is looking at three dimensions of change in humanitarian practice. Field model, field level change, which has gotten a lot of attention over the last 15 or 20 years. And you look at things like the Grand Bargain, the Transformative Agenda, a lot of that focused on guidance for field level change. But what those didn't touch enough were some of the upstream factors around financing, incentives, and governance. And so our research tries to look at all three of those look at these problems through all three of those dimensions. how to drive changes in field level practice by also looking at the incentives that are built into the financial business model of the humanitarian system and the fragmented governance of the humanitarian system. And we are in the process of writing a number of papers to propose some concrete, tangible changes to each of those dimensions to drive deeper change in humanitarian practice and humanitarian action. One of which is on all of your chairs, the most recent of which is on your chairs. So I want to say a couple words about that paper, and then I'll introduce the panel and turn to them. The fundamental question of humanitarian action is how do we provide the most useful assistance to the people who need it, and not just provide it to them passively, but work with and through their capacities and respect their prerogatives and their priorities. And for decades, that has been a core commitment of humanitarian action. It is part of the Red Cross Code of Conduct. It is part of the Good Humanitarian Donorship Standards. It's part of the Transformative Agenda. It's part of the Grand Bargain. It's part of virtually every notable humanitarian document that's come out in the last several decades. And yet, the actual change in practice over that same time period has been much less than the rhetoric might lead you to believe. And every evaluation of any of those reform initiatives over the years has shown that this is an area, probably more than any other, where the humanitarian system has not fundamentally changed. And the reasons for that go to the fundamentals of how we have set up this research project, because it's not enough to say, at a project level, we will do something different. It gets to core issues of power, and who has power and who has influence over humanitarian action and who does not, and where do those concentrations of power sit. And so what our paper proposes is 3 imperatives for reorienting and rebalancing power and influence in humanitarian decision-making in a way that is much more responsive to and aligned with the prerogatives of affected people. We identify 3 big imperatives. The first is influence. Affected people's, it's not enough to simply hear what crisis-affected people are saying. There need to be specific channels for them to influence humanitarian decision-making. If we hear their perspectives and then they're not acted upon, it doesn't do too much good. And so we propose concrete measures at a systemic governance level, at a crisis strategy and resourcing level, and at a field implementation level for explicitly bringing the voices and the influence and some leverage for affected people into humanitarian decision-making at each of those levels. So building those explicit channels for influence, and rather than just passively seeking feedback, is important to beginning to shift some of those incentives and give them more power and more voice in the system. The second big imperative is independence. A constant theme of our consultations and our research on this topic was that you can't trust, well, not that you can't, not trust exactly, but to be truly legitimate, you can't expect an organization that is the subject of feedback to be the one collecting and mediating the feedback. So in the same way that you would not allow an NGO or a UN agency to audit its own financial books, not because you believe them to be dishonest, but because there are misaligned incentives there, we should not be allowing aid agencies to tell us on behalf of the people they serve what the people they serve think. People should have their own more direct voice. And so we propose that feedback systems and accountability systems need to be much more independent of the organizations that they're commenting on. And that's important both for people's confidence in those systems, but also for the legitimacy and credibility of those sorts of mechanisms. And then the third big imperative is institutionalizing practical change. So we heard over and over from organizations we talked to that even when feedback exists, they're often constrained from acting on it by a range of just practical institutional obstacles. And those might be the fact that humanitarian groups tend to hire for technical expertise and management skill sets, whereas feedback and listening is much more of a community organizing skill set. It's a different sort of skill set than we tend to hire for in the sector. We heard from organizations that even when they get feedback, perceived donor constraints or rigid grant guidelines prevent them from acting on and applying it. So there are a range of those sorts of practical obstacles too that even if you get the rest right, can impede change. So that's the third imperative, is institutionalizing some of those wraparound changes that will enable different practices than we've seen in the past. And ultimately, we have to want to do this. So the paper lays out a range of ways that we could begin taking this agenda forward, but it also needs champions. And so we're encouraged by some of the reception that early drafts of the paper got, and we've begun dialogue with some implementing agencies to look at how some of these ideas could be taken forward. There's a very strong tendency within the humanitarian sector to revert to past equilibrium. So a little bit of change, but then the system reasserts itself, and very little changes in the long run. That can be changed, and in the paper we talk about the example of cash programming. That cash programming in a space of about 10 years went from being a sort of small peripheral boutique issue to now one of the largest areas of work in humanitarian response. And it did that because it had some very strong champions and in the aid agency community and in the donor community who were willing to say, yeah, we should move in this direction because it empowers the people who are receiving the aid, even if that means less power for us. It puts power in their hands and takes it out of ours, but it's the right thing to do, and we're going to do it. And I think we need to see that logic now applied, and those same sorts of champions willing to step forward on this wider issue. So that issue of power and how power is allocated in the sector is fundamentally important to getting accountability and getting feedback right, but it's not the only area where we have power imbalances in humanitarian response. And so, as we've looked in some of our wider research, these power imbalances are chronic across the sector, and that's probably no surprise to anyone in the room. The local NGO community feels disempowered relative to the international NGO community. The international NGO community feels disempowered relative to the UN. The UN feels disempowered relative to the donors. Well, everybody feels disempowered relative to the donors. Sometimes there's a degree to which that's just inherent. But I think we need to be much more attuned to those power imbalances and think how we can explicitly counter-program those. And so we're going to talk about that today. I want this to be a conversation first amongst our fantastic panelists, but then also, you're all experts on this in the audience here as well. So we want to broaden this out to be a conversation between the panel and the audience, as opposed to sort of a static Q&A. And so I really hope you will share some of your thoughts and your perspectives on this as we get to that part of the session. So. I am going to introduce each of the panelists, and then I have a question I'm going to pose to each of them to get us rolling, and then we'll move forward. So first to my right, Jamila Mahmood of the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, and also formerly the head of Mercy Malaysia, and also importantly for our topic here today, simply ran the preparatory consultations for the World Humanitarian Summit, including a lot of the consultation with regional groups and local groups that fed into the World Humanitarian Summit process. Heba Ali, the director of the New Humanitarian, which I hope all of you read, and if you don't, you should, and a longtime observer and constructive critic of the humanitarian sector. And Simon O'Connell, the executive director of Mercy Corps Europe, and a longtime humanitarian practitioner. So I have a question I'm going to pose to each of them, and then we're going to have a dialogue amongst them, and then we will open that dialogue up to all of you. So I want to turn first to Jamila. We have spent years affirming that we need to listen to the people we serve, that they should be at the center of humanitarian response. This for IFRC, this is a real guiding mission of what you do. Why do you think we haven't made more progress, and how do we accelerate it?
Well, first of all, thank you, Jeremy, for inviting me to be here. And I think in our preparations, you said be as frank as possible, so I will. Exactly 4 years ago and 2 months, we were here in New York, and many of you were in the same room when Erin produced a report card on our performance, where basically the affected people, community, rated and ranked how they felt about international actors, the UN, their governments and local NGOs and so on and so forth. And if you go back to that report card, the international community did abysmally badly, right? So it was a real wake-up call. And I think 4 years down the line, we're still having very similar conversations. So it's again, we get into a situation in a crisis where we're all in the same bed, if you like, but the international and the local communities have completely different dreams. So what happens is that one of the ground truth research, which was really quite important, was they said when they interviewed international communities, 93% of them felt that they were listening and they were responding to the community needs. But when they interviewed the same people, the affected people, only 53% felt they were listened to. So 93 versus, in fact, it's 58%. So that's a huge discrepancy there. So why is it that we're not listening? So I think that's a big question we have to ask. Now, I can speak on behalf of the Federation. I can speak on behalf of being a previous local and national organization as well and running the summit process. That listening itself is such an art, I think. The ability to listen with humility and respect is what's required. And unfortunately, many a time we come into a crisis situation importing our own ideas and how we think a response should be. So we rarely listen, because that's human nature, because you're here to do a job. So this is where I can speak on behalf of the Federation. Our raison d'etre is actually listening to people, because we are a network of 191 national societies in 165,000 branches around the world that are embedded in communities, and they have no choice, because part of the time they are the affected community themselves. So how we view humanitarian response is very different, because as a federation, in fact, we cannot impose on our national society what response should be. And I'll give you another example of the Ebola crisis that's ongoing in DRC. So we have 800 volunteers going door to door, listening to people and trying to figure out why is it they don't trust the provision of healthcare coming to the Ebola centers and so forth. Why is this rumor mongering that's going around that Ebola is brought to DRC, that they will not go to treatment center? Now they get all this data, right? And we put it out to everyone, but at that local level, there is no strategy. There's no strategy, there's no leadership to take that information. So you will have the data, but we don't have a commitment to work collectively to analyze, to use that data so that collectively we can bring the impact that we need. So it comes back to what we also heard during the World Humanitarian Summit process, that can we even choose one situation where we measure collective success, that each and every component, whether it's a local organization, a government, an international organization, the Red Cross, private sector, contribute to a response or recovery, and we measure the success of that based on our collective inputs. But I'll just end by saying, first of all, that this cannot happen in an emergency. And this is where, for us, we're there before, during, and after a crisis. We're there, whether you call it humanitarian or development. Where does your nose end and your face begin, right? My mother will always say that to me. Because for people on the ground, it's a continuum. They just need help. They don't know whether it's humanitarian financing that's helping them or development financing. They just know they're in trouble and they need that support. So if we really want to have a change, this has to begin by a dialogue from, pre-disaster, understanding vulnerability in a much more refined way, really having dialogue with people we don't talk to. I mean, I haven't even started talking about financing, but we'll leave that, probably it's coming. But one of the things we need to do is, whether you call it a nexus or whatever, that dialogue now needs to happen. Where is that information on at community level? And who is going to be responsible for really bringing that together and having a strategy? Is it the international community? Is it local government? Is it the local Red Cross? I don't know.
And I think that I was in Congo at the end of April, and I saw those very dynamics. Heard the exact same thing from local civil society leaders that they were sharing the feedback, but the feedback was not necessarily making its way into the strategy. And so the feedback is not self-executing. It has to feed in to power. It has to be attached to power to have influence. So how would you see that? What do you see as the entry points for that, or what is the leverage that will get that feedback turned from just something passive that is collected to something active that is used and applied?
I hate to say this, but money talks. Donors have to hold those who are accountable, right? Which means that if you set up a cluster system or a humanitarian country team or whatever that is in place in that situation, there has to be an accountability to how you use that data and how you actually demonstrate that you are listening to people and that you are responding to the needs of community. Because true accountability will never be achieved without communities actually having ownership of our work. Right? So it's not about us having ownership of our work. No, it's about people affected feeling that they are part of that dialogue, they're part of the design, they're part of the outcome that they want to see. So I think at the end of the day, unfortunately, it has to be driven by some incentives that is, and disincentives at the same time, that, people need to demonstrate that accountability to listen and to act. Yeah. I think that's in your paper too.
We make that point as well, but it's good to hear it reinforced. So Simon, you wrote a really interesting piece for The Guardian a few months ago where you talked about how the proliferation in the international NGO sector, with now so many, not just large, but also huge numbers of medium-sized and small NGOs, crowds out the space for action and the space for resources of local and emerging diaspora and global South organizations. So what do you see as the next steps on that? What should, in the NGO sector, what should you be doing? Within the donor sector, what should donors be requiring? And how much can we delegate? How much can we, as the traditional humanitarian sector, how much should we be leaving to or putting local groups on the front lines for, and where should we be pulling back the international players?
Great. So thanks, Jeremy, very much for having me here. Hi, everyone. So I promise you I've done all my pre-reading. I've got my talking points. I can do all of that. But literally, you've just kind of stimulated a thought.
Go for it.
Which I'm going to kind of try my luck with. So you were saying that on the cash transfer side, we've made more progress on that, post WHS than on other sides. At Mercy Corps, we made a commitment to transfer 20% of our humanitarian portfolio through cash transfer programming by this year, 2019. We're at 40. We're over 40% now. So we've, vastly exceeded that. And as you were talking, I was sort of wondering, so why is that? And I wonder, and I promise you this is not kind of talking point stuff, I wonder if that is actually in part because this is more about people than institutions. If you think of cash, it sort of transfers across all institutions. So I think perhaps maybe the conversation we could be having here is how much this should be about transfer of power, from the INGO Mercy Corps to the local organization, or between us as people and between, frankly, me as Simon to other people. And we're the powerful in the room. And I wonder if we get lost in our own institutions and we maybe we make it overly complex by talking about transfer of power from institution or NGO to local NGO. And I'll give you, just because we've done 1, 2, now 3 examples from DR Congo. I've been to DRC twice in the last 4 months, I think. Goma, we run a huge program there. Pretty impactful one, supported by DFID in the main. And I met a woman who we're supporting women's associations with advocacy work. So she works for a CBO, a community-based organization, somewhat oddly, but also she's a member of the local district government. So she works for government. She's working very closely with Mercy Corps, so she's a Mercy Corps partner. and she runs her own business, small shop, smelling stuff. So she's private sector, she's government, she's local NGO, and she's working in partnership with a big-ish INGO. So if we're talking about a transfer of power, what are we talking about in that context? Power from what to what? Frankly, what we're talking about and what's desperately needed in that context in Eastern DRC is empowerment of women, like the person I met, where you've got higher levels of sexual and gender-based violence than anywhere else in the world. And that's not necessarily a transfer of power from a mercy corps to a local organization. That's empowerment of her as an individual, and that's actually more than that. That's a loss of power from people like me, from people who work for Mercy Corps, from people who work within that humanitarian architecture who've been, within that system for the last 25 plus years. It's definitely transfer of power from government to her as an individual. So that's a slightly random way of answering your first.
No, I think that's a great way of it, and it raises for me a kind of a natural follow-up question, which is if we can do that with cash, if we all, I think, broadly recognize now in humanitarian practice that cash grant programming is a good way to go, and it's good because it's efficient, and it's good because it helps people meet their needs, but it's also fundamentally good for the reason that you cited, which is that it shifts that power on what is needed from international or even a local actor to the person receiving the aid. So could we do that with other forms of programming as well? Can we only do that with cash, or would there be ways to approach WASH programming or food programming or other forms of programming that would let the prioritization be driven by the people we're serving rather than sort of our normal systems and structures?
Yeah, I think absolutely we can, and I think if there's an explicit intent to do so, yes, we can. And thank you for saying nice things about that article. A few months ago, after that, we held a debate with ODI around, should NGOs like Mercy Corps, is there a need for more consolidation within the sector, and particularly within the INGO sector? And we, sort of the Mercy Corps perspective was, absolutely, it's desperately needed. Not everywhere, but in a context like South Sudan, where you've got 250 odd NGOs operating, and huge need, and need to address the root causes of all that, protracted crisis and fragility, but a huge need to be vastly more outcome focused and vastly more efficient. And I gave the example from our work in Iraq. We've been running the cash consortium there, Mosul, one part of the country where that's hugely impactful and very important. But frankly, it hasn't resulted in cost efficiencies across the five, and I'm not going to reel the names out, but 5 big international NGOs. We've all got our own individual structures, our own country directors, our own procurement people, our own security people, our own finance people, et cetera, et cetera. And if we just explicitly said, through a consortium like that, through a program like that, we could intentionally forge some more efficient ways of working together at a consolidation level at that country, or potentially even beyond that, and then with those freed up resources in partnership with our donors, say, we're calling out 25% of that funding pot to go directly towards supporting other organizations, be those local civil society, be they something different. And let's not, of course, forget the private sector. I've just come from Sudan last week, is where I started with Mercy Corps in 2004, and staggering, big changes taking place in that country. Clearly some big risks as well, a lot of complexity, but a certain cause for optimism. And one of my causes for optimism is the private sector could get more involved, particularly if there's a loosening of the state-sponsored terrorism legislation, and therefore we as an international community say, let's not pour hundreds of millions of dollars into the Mercy Corps or the big INGOs. Let's enable the private sector. Let's figure out some ways to kind of de-risk that investment, and let's be intentional about it.
Right. So Heba, you've been a keen observer of the humanitarian sector for a while now. We've known each other for a while, and you've pushed us throughout that whole time. You run what used to be called IRIN, is now called the Humanitarian, And as I understand it, you chose that name to highlight the fact that we are moving, hopefully, into a new humanitarian future that is not just about the same old big institutions that have traditionally dominated humanitarian response, but is more focused on the people on the front lines, the people in communities who are the first responders in any crisis. So I'm interested in hearing a little bit more about how you see them evolving as a force shaping humanitarian priorities, and also what sort of pushback or what sort of reactions do you see from the old guard players as these new emerging players potentially threaten some of their prerogatives?
Yes, absolutely. The new humanitarian sees itself as examining what humanitarianism means in the modern age. I wouldn't go so far to say that it means putting people at the center, because I'm not sure that that has yet proven itself to be true, but it certainly means a different set of players, different set of approaches, a much messier definition of humanitarian action today. And I think the best example of how the winds of power are changing is look at Greta. I mean, she is single-handedly shaping the way the world reacts to climate change. It's not the UN in the lead, it's a 16-year-old girl. So I can give you, I'll list them off. The refugee response in Europe, it was private citizens who were pulling people out of the boats when UNHCR's offices were closed at 5 p.m. and the mattresses were locked inside the office. It was these volunteers that were trying to find some way to deal with the situation. You look, Simon mentioned the private sector. I sit on the World Economic Forum's Global Future Council for the Humanitarian System. It's co-chaired by MasterCard. You've got the Salesforces of the world, the MasterCards of the world, the Accentures of the world, doing things that the humanitarian sector could never do at that kind of scale. And precisely to your point, they're super frustrated because rather than the humanitarian sector saying, thank you very much, you've taken a load off of our hands, they're instead trying to protect their space. And so, for instance, Tara Nathan, who co-chairs this council, she's saying, we're spending our time and energy fighting for a place at the table when, in fact, what we're trying to do is let you focus on your core business and you let us focus on ours. We know how to do mobile money. We know how to do cash programming. You guys are trying to hire people from, AI backgrounds. You have no clue what you're doing in this space. Leave it to the experts who are willing to put their own money into it and divert your money to the places where they can't. And yet you see this kind of protectionism taking place. Other emerging players, the diaspora, we saw the role that they played in the 2014 Ebola response. Local organizations, I wouldn't call them a new player, but finally they're getting some recognition. We've done a whole series on locally led humanitarian response called From the Ground Up, and it was meant to really give representation more than anything to a kind of whole dynamic within the sector that is absolutely ignored, and Jamila talked a little bit about it, but rather than, as you said off the top, there's so much talk about localization and the desire to devolve power. When you actually find yourself in a situation where local actors are able and present, what you get from the rest of the sector is this kind of expectation that local actors have to over-impress to be taken seriously, and international actors have to profoundly fail to be dismissed. And so there's this inequilibrium that we see playing out over and over. So I think for the most part, in terms of the quote-unquote old guards pushback, either you get, I'll give you a great example. We hosted an event in Davos, which was really trying to introduce this concept of new humanitarians, who we define as people who are looking around the world, seeing a turbulent, crazy place and asking themselves, what's my role in doing something about this? And that's many of the various groups of people I've just outlined. And we had a young YouTube star called Jerome Jarre join the discussion. So he used to spend his time making YouTube videos and Instagram posts and had millions of followers, and then one day was enlightened and decided that he was going to start directing his influence online towards humanitarian causes, and started an NGO called Love Army, which then went on to respond to drought in Somalia, earthquake in Mexico, the Rohingya, etc. So we have this guy on stage, and among many others, and someone from WFP stands up in the audience and he says, yes, we all embrace the multiplicity of actors in the sector, but we need to be careful about humanitarian principles, and I'm just not really sure that every one of these new actors is really on board with this. And the guy looks at him, Jerome, and he just says, you want to talk to me about principles? You are distributing, the way he put it, rotten food with your brand all over it to people who are desperate and important. All you care about is advancing your careers, and you're going to tell me about humanitarian principles. So just to say, I think there's a whole...
So there's a perception problem there at a minimum.
And there's an inherent tension between a sector that has super professionalized for very good reason, and in so doing has lost part of its soul, and these new players in the space who bring back some of that heart, but in many cases don't know what they're doing, don't have the standards, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And I think how that plays out and the degree to which the sector is able to positively leverage those forces will be a determining factor. I'll just say one last thing. I think this discussion about feedback and it needing to be independent, of course. And we've long said in no other sector will you see the same actors responsible for assessing the needs, responding to those needs, and then reporting back on the quality of their response. That's a clear conflict of interest, and it wouldn't be acceptable anywhere else. And yet, when we're talking about life and death, that's perfectly fine.
Yeah.
But I think we need to go way beyond independent feedback. Like what the people that we talk to when we, over the course, for instance, of this localization series that we've been doing, what they want is not to be able to provide feedback. They want to be in the driver's seat of their own response. And so to really flip the switch and say, how do people who are at the center of these crises be the first decision maker, and that goes to budget and priorities and all the rest of it, that's where I think the conversation needs to be, and where you've often steered it. But it's not a hypothetical. I mean, these things are already happening. So Danish Church Aid has a program where they give funding to communities, and those communities then decide what their priorities are, how they want to spend it. They do their own budgets, and then they report back yes, they do report back to Danish Church Aid, but mostly they report back to each other. So the accountability is to the community, not back to the donor. The Dutch Relief Alliance is an example of a group of NGOs that are already trying to pool their resources, and rather than compete with one another, say, how can we assess the added value of each one of us and then work more coherently. So these things are not so impossible. They are happening in small places here and there, and it's more a question of, do they have momentum, or are they stymied from above?
Right. I think, Jamil, you wanted to respond to something Simon said.
Maybe to Simon's point about cash, I think one thing that probably was missed is the whole issue of dignity. I think we forget. It's not just about efficiency, right? It's about dignity. I'll give you a short story about a situation in Africa. It was a food security situation, and a woman was given a cash voucher. My boss actually followed her to the shop, and he said he wanted to see what she would buy with the cash voucher. Now, this is a situation of food insecurity, and you would probably think she's going to buy some flour or whatever that they eat. She bought a bottle of shampoo, anti-lice shampoo, and a bar of soap. That was her priority. Because for her, her kids had to smell good. They had to get rid of the lice for them to be socially acceptable within the kids' community. Now, that is all about dignity. How would you know, as somebody coming in to do a response, what the person actually needs at that point in time? And it's so contextual. And if you look at Bangladesh in Cox's Bazar, more than half of the relief items given are sold because people want cash, right? So we are one of the few organizations that are allowed to do some small cash programs because the government has restrictions. But that means so much to the community to be able to have that choice and that dignity to decide what they want. Now, onto Heba, I completely agree with you. What I think is the problem with our sector is that we are living in the present. We look at things from where we are, and we don't look at things from where we will be. And where we will be is a different world where governance is not going to look the way it is now. We're going to live in a world where institutions are not going to be respected the way they are now. this is the trend. It's being shown now in so many ways where people will rise and say, I want to do this myself. I want to get out there and do things. And here we are trying to protect our turf and trying to figure out what to do. And as the Red Cross, obviously we hold our principles very close to our heart. But we've realized now the only way we can move forward is to make sure the principles are just understood by everyone. You don't have to be a humanitarian actor. The principles are not rocket science. Right, but then again, you come to a situation in our consultations on localization, for example, and you talk about principles. When we were in Iraq, and the local actors said to us, well, sometimes it's a real paradox. We're caught because we are under pressure from governments and so on and so forth, but we are the only ones who have access. So sometimes we have to balance our principles. Do we go on the basis of humanity first to serve the people's needs, or do we really go on to independence and neutrality? Now, every situation will be different. And I think this is where we have to wake up and realize that it's not business as usual anymore. You have situations where international actors are not welcomed anymore. Even Indonesia doesn't welcome international actors after a situation there. So, how do we get international actors to realize they have to rethink and reimagine their role?
Yeah,
Please. Yeah.
No, go ahead.
I would just question whether this is about, and I think it's absolutely an important conversation to say how do these actors devolve power. But there's also another dynamic that's happening, which is that they're losing power without choosing to.
That's right.
And so if you look at the global givings of the world, you mentioned it earlier, I can take out my money and give it directly to someone in Bangladesh or in Kenya, and I don't need any of these intermediaries, and we're absolutely moving in that direction. So it's happening regardless, and there are many models that we can imagine and that are already taking place in small degrees. So for instance, I was part of a core design group that was convened by ODI to kind of reimagine the humanitarian sector in a way that would better meet its end users' needs, and they used design thinking, and in fact one of the designers who was involved with that is here. And one of the ideas we came up with through that process was a kind of Airbnb for humanitarian response. So a networked model of humanitarianism whereby it's the person who needs help who is activating some kind of call to say, this is the specific problem I have, and this is the specific issue I need help with, rather than the kind of template UN cookie cutter response, and that you can first look to your neighbor for the generator, and then you can look to your government, and then you can look to the regional players, and then you can look to the MSFs and the Mercy Corps of the world if no one else can meet the needs first. And so that you can be matching need with response in a much more sophisticated way. My point is, this kind of model is already going to be pushing out the more traditional system. And so when you look at, what are the factors that can incentivize change, one of them will be the whole kind of world moving in a different direction and some of these players being left behind. And maybe that's one of the only ways that it will happen.
Yeah. So just to kind of build on that, but I do kind of worry that we may be getting overly down on, there are great organizations, there are great people doing their absolute best in some very, very tough places. And one of the things, Jeremy, you and I sort of talked about earlier is so Mercy Corps' work inside Syria. A huge amount of that is delivered through a partner support program, incredible network of extraordinarily brave and effective individuals working with and for local organizations. And we have, we put out a report in, I guess it was 2016, called Cracking the Code, around how we figured out how to operate in that very, very complex, high-risk environment. We set up sort of analysis teams, monitoring shifts in humanitarian need and context. So we sort of figured out a way to operate and to partner much more effectively in a really high-risk, complex, volatile environment. However, what we touched on was, so how come Mercy Corps isn't doing that in other similar contexts? And I think, I don't have a beautiful answer to that, but I wonder as well, because, often as an international NGO, we will talk about squeezing of humanitarian space for us, and I'm not going to reel out the countries, but we all know which ones are particularly challenging. But there's also real challenges with, empowering and working with local civil society organizations, and also in empowering individuals in a whole host of those contexts. So it's not, I would worry if we overly default to, the kind of big humanitarian organizations don't want to do that. There are some real constraints as well.
And I think what that gets to, and I'm interested in what you all think of this, I think what that starts to point to is a sort of a shifting of the role of what international players should do within response, because it does. I think there is a very natural question: if a group, if major NGOs like Mercy Corps and I think most of the others that are operating in northern Syria as well, or in Somalia, or in some of the more remote, inaccessible parts of many of Yemen and other countries in the world, are now working as the main model, working through networks of local organizations, and so becoming a kind of broker and supporter and enabler of a wider network of local actors. Why only do that in constrained access environments? I mean, it's done by necessity in constrained access environments, because you can't go in with a big international logo and plant a flag in the way that you can, and we've traditionally done in a place like South Sudan. But why shouldn't that then be the default model? And how do we get there?
So I think, if I may, I think there has been some pretty good evolution in this direction. I think of, a host of donors sort of move increasingly into the resilience space. And Jeremy, when you're at OFDA, the ability to be a little bit more, responsive, flexible, adaptive, things like crisis modifiers to enable us to pivot back into deeper humanitarian crises as and when those contexts arise. So I do think some of that is happening. We talk a lot, without getting too jargony, about being catalysts in an ecosystem. I think possibly we, international NGOs, think too much about that ecosystem as ourselves, government, private sector, and possibly there's more for us to do around also exploring that local civil society network. But I do think there has been progress in that space, and I think a challenge to further progress, remains still the funding models, the architecture, the rigidity, the sort of logical frameworks. So there are some barriers there. And then to your other point, I think we could do better at being really clear around our role, our role to influence policy, our role to really push out into those most marginalized places, our role to at times test innovations, particularly in those more risky environments where perhaps we have a little bit more space and freedom to do so, and then at the same time be clear around what is not our role. And I think particularly for organizations like Mercy Corps, outside of the really fragile environments, outside of the sort of really gnarly, protracted crises, our role is increasingly really not terribly relevant. And you mentioned Greece, and we responded in Greece. I think we did some important work. I think we set up some sort of things like Signpost, an online portal platform for refugees to have access for information. But I think as an international community, we possibly look to do too much within the traditional model rather than mobilizing others. And I think we need to be more disciplined in saying no, including in those sort of natural disaster responses, and more disciplined in knowing what our role is.
Jeremy, can I ask you a question? Because I'm a journalist, and
Go for it. That's
you
why you're
used
here.
to be the head of OFDA. How impossible, I'm going to collect like a bunch of different ideas that I've come across through many of these kinds of discussions. How unrealistic is the following? You have countries giving mandatory contributions to a pooled, anonymous fund. You have an independent body that does needs assessments to say where are the needs greatest, not by mandate of UN agency, but by geographic area. You then have that pooled fund distribute money to local level community bodies, and I know that is a whole world unto itself of challenges, but let's just go with it for now. And they then decide on their priorities and budgets, and then report back to the donors and to themselves. And where they need to, they then subcontract the international NGOs for advocacy purposes, for fundraising purposes, or for technical areas that they don't have expertise in. Is that so? If you had the political will, from a technical perspective, is that so impossible from a donor?
I think elements of that. So kind of putting my old former donor hat back on. I think the mandatory contributions part is probably a non-starter because mandatory contributions or assessed contributions tend to be a very small chunk of humanitarian resource flows, and I think anytime you get a large enough dollar figure, the donors want to have some control over at least some of the parameters of where that's going or what that's going for, and so I think they're willing to give that up when they see a compelling kind of compelling proposition of impact and accountability that then trades off their own control over it. And so there are a lot of donors that contribute large money to the SURF and to other pooled funds. And as some of my past writing has argued, they do much the same when they make large contributions to UN agencies. The UN agencies are in effect large pooled funds for their own respective mandates. Yep. So I think there is willingness on behalf of donors to sign off their own control over the money as long as they have confidence that they understand how it's going to be used and spent and that they have confidence that that will be responsible and sufficiently accountable. So I think that's the challenge then for something like what you're proposing is what would be the controls and what would be the accountability on it. But I think if those things could be satisfied, yeah, I could see something like that working, and I could see that being a future some form of that being a future direction for UN country-based pooled funds. That they could be, right now the pooled funds are mostly small, and they are these sort of boutique tools that fund in between the main parts of response financing. But when they get to a certain level, and in DRC, since we're talking about DRC a lot today, in DRC it's more than 10% of total response financing. So that is the equivalent of a sort of large mid-sized donor, in effect, within that response, and it can have some influence. So I think that there is the potential for a country-based pooled fund to move in that direction, and I could see donors buying in as long as they're confident in what they're seeing.
But Heber, to be a journalist as well, to what end? What's the because if it's if we're ultimately talking about shifting power from the powerful to the powerless, what?
Well, then the donor is not deciding what the priorities are. The UN agencies that each have their own interests are not deciding what the priorities are. And it's the communities that are most affected that get that decision-making power. And you guys are not an intermediary.
Mm-hmm.
Can I come in on this?
Yeah.
I think one of the things that came up during the process of the World Humanitarian, I'm laughing here to myself because this actually same conversation happened during the process of the WHS. And one of the things that came up was, can we have an independent needs assessment even? For example, how do these numbers come out that, you need X billion for this response? And Patty, you're nodding because you remember this conversation. And even that was a problem. Yeah. Because people couldn't agree because this absolute reluctance of giving up mandates and power, right? But I want to come back to what we've done well. I think we have to acknowledge some things that are really, really good. Charter for Change, for example. CAFOD, I know Islamic Relief is in this room, and others have come together to say we want to commit to change, where we really look at strengthening capacities and so forth. I'm quite allergic to the word capacity building or empowerment. It's really sharing, because sometimes they have more knowledge and power than you. So I think that it's about sharing that capacity and that knowledge. But the other thing is that, we have to also, the humanitarian budget is minuscule compared to what finance is available globally. We're talking about, say, SDGs, right? There's a need for 3 trillion a year. And the current figures are, 30 billion, 280 billion, I can't remember the numbers now, per year that's available. There's 300 trillion out there in terms of whether it's domestic finance, remittances, all the finance put together. You have more finance sometimes in country than the humanitarian budget. So I think what we need to do is have a complete shift in the way we look at things. I mean, my advice to local organizations is, why are you begging the internationals? Why can't you look at domestic fundraising, right? How do we capacitate them to get access to that? And here we are in a situation, I'm going to be very frank here, because this was discussed in the Jakarta consultation, where international organizations nationalize themselves and build an organization and call it a local organization because it has local staff. So that infuriates local actors, because they say not only now they have to compete against international actors, they have to compete in their domestic markets, in international actors that localize. So we have a real problem here, right? So I think for me, what we're trying to do at the Federation, I'll give you two things we're trying to do. Number one, we need to capacitate our national societies. Not all of them are strong. Some of them are really, really weak. We cannot do it on our own. We've now joined forces with ICRC. We built a National Society Investment Alliance. We think it's an investment. But that capacity sharing or development or whatever we want to do could be done by UNICEF, could be done by World Food Programme, could be done by somebody, could be done by Pricewaterhouse. The National Society determines what its capacity needs are, not us. Even though we have a capacity assessment tool and all that, at the end of the day, the leadership has to look at it and say, well, we want to make sure that we have X, Y, and Z first. And we want organization or company A, B, and C to do that for us. Not you, but somebody else, okay? That's number one. The second thing we're doing is we're trying to tackle some of the biggest problems we have. For example, we're looking at cholera. How do we end cholera? How do you mobilize $160 million so that we can actually reach 5 million people in 5 years? And the only way to do it is to look outside and to bring external parties into the dialogue to look at what the collective outcome, what is the collective impact that we want to achieve, so that everybody is going to benefit, most of all the people. So our conversations must go beyond looking at the regular donors and the regular humanitarian pots that we're looking at, because they're really very, very small. And there is a place for everyone. The humanitarian needs are so huge. A local organization cannot do everything on its own. It needs international actors. It will need donors. It will need private sector. But we've got to really try to better design what success looks like for everyone. So that's about reimagining, how you demonstrate success, and for donors to also be able to be a bit more imaginative to say to the recipients of funding, to say, that's good. That may not be the usual way you do things, but that's actually very good, right? So how do you reimagine that?
So I want to hear from the audience. We have many people in this audience who could just as easily be on this panel, and so I'd like you to pretend a little bit that you are. And let's rather than have a sort of static Q&A, let's have more of a dialogue. And I want to pose one or two questions to you. Who do you think has too much power in the system right now? What are the imbalances that worry you? And what would it concretely look like for those actors to give up some of that power? What stands in the way of a more fundamental power shift? We've talked for a long time now about the need to begin devolving power, the need to share power. I don't think there's a lot of debate anymore about that as a rhetorical point. But when you begin getting into the practicalities, that's when it gets quite difficult. So we have some folks with mics who can come, and we'll take some comments, and very interested to hear from hear your thoughts. I saw one in the back, and then Catherine there. And just please give a quick introduction of yourself as well.
Hi, my name is Nasser Haghamed. I'm the CEO of Islamic Relief Worldwide. We operate in about 31 countries, I think Jamila mentioned. Thank you for all panelists, and it was quite useful to hear what you said and your views. I do not totally disagree that the humanitarian system needs change. It needs to be improved, or it may radically change. But I think sometimes we give certain examples and context, and we try to generalize it. Hiba said the NGO sector doesn't like the private sector, they are the old guards, and so on. It's not true. I was a member of the Global Future Council for 2 years, and we did like what MasterCard, Ericsson, Orange, anybody was bringing into the table. But I did challenge them with one thing. Will you be able to work everywhere we work? Or will you be picking and choosing so that where it's going to be profitable, you will work there. When it's very dangerous, You will not. MasterCard started in Jordan giving vouchers to Syrian refugees. Very stable country. But it wouldn't go to Yemen. Currently, in Yemen, Islamic Relief is the largest partner of WFP. We feed 2 million people a month. And I visited many of the distribution places 2 months ago. The situation is so hard, no private sector will be willing to come and risk their money or their resources.
But Nasser, that's the whole point. So let them do Jordan.
So now what
you
I'm
do
saying,
Yemen.
what I'm saying is that what happens, I build the capacities and resources, and that costs me a lot of money to do work in Yemen. But when there is an easy job, overhead costs, that other things, I can sometimes cost recovery in Jordan, the private sector is taking it. So they're not taking as much risk as the NGOs. Our staff get killed. Our staff get detained. We've been working in Gaza for over 20 years. Let me tell you, the Israeli government in 2014 designated Islamic Relief as a terrorist organization. We asked the top 4 auditing firms, can you go and audit our West Bank and Gaza offices? They said we wouldn't be able to do so, because if we give you clean bill of health, then we'll be in trouble with the Israelis. We'll be in trouble with the United Arab Emirates, who also designated as a terrorist organization. Are they willing to take that risk?
No, they're
They're not.
They're not, of course they're
So
not.
then it is difficult. This is where my challenge is. I don't have a problem with them. Humanitarian principles, they are human beings like me. I know they will adhere to humanitarian principles, but they don't take the risk that we take. So unless there is an equal and equity in terms of the way we deal, we'll always have a problem. Otherwise, we can't just give examples where MasterCard has been successful or Salesforce is successful.
So
I'll give you one final example. We've been trying to roll out our IT system, our financial system in Yemen. We couldn't do it because we don't have the bandwidth. We've been able to do it in Gaza, but we can't do it in Yemen. The whole infrastructure does not help you. So Salesforce would not come there. Microsoft would not come there. There is no infrastructure. So these are the challenges. I'm not saying we don't need to reform. I totally agree with that. But I don't think we should talk about the humanitarian actors like NGOs, that we are the old guards and we don't want any reform.
We're being a little intentionally provocative.
Anyway, thank you very much.
I mean, I'm as much of that part of that old guard as anyone.
By the way, when we rebranded, somebody sent us a tweet saying, what about the old humanitarians? So we do try to be a bit
Still a
conscious.
few of us. No, but I think that's a really interesting. So there's a lot interesting in what you said. I want to just home in on one point, which is that we perhaps need to be a little more explicit about where what is the value add of an INGO and what is the value add of a private sector, and not expect that those are interchangeable, and that's going to be defined not just by perhaps a capacity, but it might also be defined by a context. That there are certain things. I think you're right. One of my frustrations with the private sector has long been they talk, a lot of private sector companies talk a good game about wanting to be involved in humanitarian response, but they're not showing up at the cluster meetings. They're not putting people on the ground in hard environments.
If they showed up at the cluster meeting, would you let them in the door?
I would. I don't.
Not everyone.
I don't do the attendance roster for the cluster meetings. But the point is more. The example that I would give sometimes when I was at OFTA was whenever there was a new natural disaster, we would suddenly be flooded by outreach from the private sector wanting to get involved. And asking what they should be doing. And we didn't at that point have the bandwidth. I didn't have NGOs knocking down my door saying, what should we be doing? They knew what they should be doing because they were investing in being part of and understanding the system. And so I think it does kind of go both ways. That if, there is certainly, to your point, a need for more openness towards some of that, but that needs to also go both ways so that there's investment in being part of it.
But Jeremy, there's something in the middle. Again, the danger of kind of lumping everything into neat boxes. Some brilliant mind the other day somewhere said we're increasingly being sectioned into, increasingly being portioned into sections of the like-minded. And we are in our world now, we're just being kind of lumped into our boxes, the NGOs here, the private sector. I think we need to be really careful around the labeling. NASA for sure know and feel for you and the whole Palestine challenges ourselves. We work very, very closely with seed funding from Google on a program called Gaza Sky Geeks, which is supporting young entrepreneurs, startups through a sort of incubator and accelerator model. That's now generated over $1 million of income inside Gaza and is expanding into the West Bank. That was a initial really cool, neat private sector collaboration between ourselves and Google, and it's generating profit for young people in Gaza. So these opportunities to kind of seed private sector collaborations, to pilot them, and then look for ways to scale are hugely important, and they transcend the NGO, the private sector in their boxes.
Catherine, I think you had your hand next. Over here.
Thank you. I'm Catherine Bertini, and I once was at WFP. But Jeremy, your point about where the power sits, I fully agree. Probably everybody does, starting from the donors and bottoming out with the community organizations. So it would be great if the panel would talk about the donor governments in particular, and what their responsibilities are, because a WFP or a UNHCR or an NGO is going to be much more responsive to ultimately what the donors want, but except for pushing issues like cash, I haven't seen the donors be proactive about change, nor proactive about governance and what their appropriate roles are in the different organizations. So I wondered if the panel could address that.
Well, and we also have some folks from donors in the room, so I don't know if I should put any of them on the spot, but I wonder if any of them would be interested to respond to that.
Can I answer from the grand bargain perspective?
Why don't you do that?
I'll
and then
try,
if any of the donors would like a moment to give a thought and respond to Catherine.
So in the grand bargain, obviously there's a lot of signatories. Many of them are donors, and they are state donors. And one of the good things that have come out of the grand bargain is really beginning that conversation, right? And whole localization workstream looking at as directly as possible. Well, it's slow, but at least 7 of the signatories are now giving as directly as possible more than 25%, more equal than 30 or 25%. I mean, some donors, for example, Australia, I think it's Netherlands, a few are already giving directly to local actors, which is great. But it's not enough. Now, how do we, with the good humanitarian donorship principles, with all the donor support groups that we have, how do we, create this peer pressure, if you like, among the donors to make it possible? Now, it's not a standalone. It goes back to reporting and all the other elements of the grand bargain. If you're going to have, 25 types of reports for local organizations to fill, they can't do it, right? So the simplification of reporting, all the other elements of the grand bargain, the multi-year funding, most of the local organizations can never gain power because they're feeding, hand to mouth, because projects are short-term. They don't look into the longer-term vision for the organization to strengthen. So all these things, there's so many things you have to do before you get to a shifting of the power. And that is really very much in the donors' hands. So if they can begin first by a simplified reporting mechanism that everybody can follow, that is possible even for local organizations to do. And this is where international organizations play such an important role. Why can't international organizations embed staff into local organizations so that they can build the ability for them to, say, management, financial management or reporting or whatever? This is how you reimagine your role. And donors should incentivize that and allow international organizations to give them financing for them to play that role, right? So,
Jeremy, I'm happy to give a both sides answer to that question. And it's absolutely not my intention to come on a panel with Jeremy and say nice things about you in public, but I do think the kind of move when you're at OFDA in terms of increased joined upness between OFTA and across other donors and then within other AID mechanisms was a really good step forward. I think the increased focus on resilience frameworks, I think we've seen real progress there. You know, the Sahel and the Horn come to mind, you know, with that sort of flexibility. I think a lot of what DFID's done in sort of leading on inception phases and then that flowing through, you know, a design process into longer term programming. I think that's been a good step forward. And then I think kind of more predictable, longer term, multi-annual funding, we've certainly seen progress there. So that's all been good. I think what hasn't been good, and where we feel a whole load of pain is the absorption of risk. And I think the burden of risk is absolutely unacceptably too much for political reasons placed on implementing partners, be they, you know, the kind of INGOs or local partners in those, again, really gnarly, protracted crisis, volatile environments like Yemen, where no one, you know, including Mercy Corps, no one is getting everything right. And we need greater space to discuss what we're not getting right. We need greater acceptance of that. We need the ability to highlight the quite extraordinary levels of need. Yemen, I think the humanitarian appeal is about 34% funded, and where are we late September? You know, there's 23 million people in need of humanitarian assistance, 70% of the country. So it's absolutely not in any way a time to be lessening support for Yemen, but the levels of risk, the complexity, and, you know, the failings of the system need to be talked about, and our donors need to be partners. Since I've been doing this job, and many might say too long now, the word partner between the implementer and the donor is increasingly in scarce supply, and that's hugely alarming.
Big implementing, small partner.
But in a nutshell, if I could just add, I mean, the donors could legislate so much of what we're talking about. I really find it mind-boggling and I've had donors ask me, like, oh, what do you think we could be doing? I'm like, really? Like, legislate that you have to consult local communities, legislate that the needs assessment has to be independent. Like, so much of the power is in I used to tell Jeremy all the time, like, now you're talking about power. Why didn't you talk about it when you were in power? But but he did. He did, as Simon has alluded to. But I think what we've seen in this sector is that when charismatic leaders champion certain issues, you can get movement. And Kristalina Georgieva is a good example of that. And for me, the models exist. It's not a question of not knowing how to. Yes, there are some very real challenges for donors, and often they're having to change their laws to be able to do some of the things that they commit to on the humanitarian side. But all you need is a few people who are willing to really push this, and I think the rest would follow.
I think
I know there is tremendous inertia, tremendous interest in the donors funding.
Richard, I'm going to make you take a mic and make this point in a minute. I want to just invite, if there are any of the donors in the room. I see Nick. So Nick, if you'd like to maybe speak to this from a different perspective, and are you a donor there as well? Yes, Dane, right? Yeah. So Nick, and then Dane, and then maybe we'll turn to Richard. So Nick, over here. Somebody with a mic for. There we go.
Yeah, hi, I'm Nick Dyer. I'm one of the Director Generals in DFID. So, speaking to Catherine's point, there's huge frustration. And I think that plays out in what you see happening on the development of the whole insurance work within humanitarian. So let's find a different way of funding the system. Let's find a different way of directing the resources. I think there's the grand bargain. I think the role of the World Bank, increasingly trying to get the World Bank into the fragility space, is a response to frustrations we see in the system. So there's huge frustration, but there's also, I mean, I agree, there's huge inertia. Now, why is there inertia? Because there's a sort of unwritten contract going on in the system, which is the public is saying we will support aid because we like humanitarian. The donors want to sustain that support. They have a system that has been built and broadly works albeit with lots of frustration around it. And really shifting that and changing that runs the risk of breaking that contract. And that is a real fear that the contract gets broken.
Yeah.
Because that would then have a lot of intended consequences of doing that.
Yeah.
Now that said, things do change. So cash changes. So how do you get donors to change? I mean, donors change when, and the cash is a really interesting example, where that's built on a huge amount of evidence that it works, that it works in certain contexts, that it isn't wasted, that it leads to improvements in efficiency. And we in DFID, I mean, like it or not, and a lot of people I know don't like it, and I know that it introduces all challenges around power and abuse of power, but we are so frustrated. We are introducing performance-based funding and performance-based funding to the UN system and saying, well, look, I mean, if you don't start working collectively and achieving some collective changes like improving your needs-based system, we're going to take the money away from you. We're going to give it to someone else. Now, no one else will follow us in that approach. And maybe because we got it wrong, but we've got ourselves to the point where we're so frustrated that we're prepared to start introducing performance funding in it. So we're prepared to really challenge the system, but I do think there will be losers in the system, and this is a question around whether we're prepared to accept the winners and losers and the impact that will have on upsetting that contract.
Yeah. And I want to turn to Dane from the UAE, but just a quick reaction to that, and from my past as a donor as well. I think, if you take senior UN officials out for a drink and have a real conversation about whether things need to change, no one would dispute. No one would sincerely dispute, or no one would sincerely say everything's working fine. But I think that same fear that you're articulating about kind of rupturing the contract between a donor and its public, there's a very similar dynamic with some of the UN agencies that there's recognition that the current setup is not optimal, but a lot of fear about what happens if you open the box of admitting that. Yeah, Dan.
Thank you very much. Just a couple of perspectives, more from the Gulf than just the UAE. Historically, we've put very, very little of our money through multilateral channels. It's almost exclusively bilateral and through our own aid organizations. And so for us, a lot of the international humanitarian organizations are really the most radical voices in our orbit and drive a lot of the change within the system. So the kind of legislation that you're asking donors to impose on agencies, it's often in reverse for us, where the agencies come with ideas that rock our system and that lead to improvements in it. So we see them I personally see them as a very positive part of our own planning process. I mean, typically in the Gulf, you have a mindset that's, would probably be called paternalistic in a lot of the West, like let's send blankets, let's send, certain types of food. There's not a big culture of reporting. There's a lot of security concern, who's actually receiving the money. The risk appetite is often a lot lower. If 30% of the people might not be on the good list, well, that's a very, that's maybe not palatable. In another place, it might be. So for us, when especially the scale that we've engaged in Yemen, you have WFP saying, we're going to do cash whether you like it or not. And then we now have this experience where we've actually funded cash programs for multiple years, despite hating cash for the last 20 years. Yeah. So this has been a really good development, and I think for us, as we kind of move toward this brave new world that Heb has laid out, a lot of it comes down to the voices that are that have access to leadership, because we're very top down in the way that money is allocated and the way that decisions are taken. So the more that people, whether it's the Secretary General of the UN or the president of a country, says that we really want you, you should put 20% of your money through SURF or something like that. These are the kind of asks that then that kind of resonate down through the system. So that's the kind of the point where we're at, where I think we're probably not having the conversation that you guys are having. The old humanitarians are pretty radical for us still. And so but we're also in this very unique position where we don't have the bureaucracy that Western countries have, and we can make very, very rapid change very, very quickly, as you have probably seen, in the news about all sorts of things that we do. So that's the kind of the space that we're in right now. Thank you.
That's fascinating. All right, so there's a lot of other hands, so maybe I'll go here first.
Hi, my name is Aisha Dennis. I'm the Program Director for Women Now for Development, which is a Syrian-led organization. I'm here because I'm one of the very, very few people in the organization who are not Syrian, and therefore I'm able to enter the United States. So please take me seriously still as representing a local organization. The issue for us is really that local organizations are not in the conversation and have to fight to be included. And even when we're consulted about what our opinion is on localization and how that should be happening, what we are saying is not being taken seriously.
Yep.
And the leadership is happening on the ground. It's not an issue of us waiting for INGOs to come in and catalyze what we're doing or mobilize what we're doing. We're doing it. It was being led by women on the ground way before we even were established as an organization. There's quite a few issues that I think could be addressed, which haven't been mentioned, so I'll try to go through them quickly in bullet point. One is language. It's 2019, this crisis in Syria started in 2011, and still the whole system is dominated by English. The cluster system meetings happen in English, proposals have to be submitted in English. I'm able to do that. Most local organizations cannot. Why do I have a call from a colleague in Yemen who's saying, I've developed this proposal, I look at it, it's fantastic, but she can't submit it on her own because it's in Arabic. Why are we struggling for core funding all the time when we have donors coming to us all the time saying, we think you're doing fantastic work, we want to support you? Well, while we're fighting for just to secure the senior management positions, just to secure the management positions that are necessary to fulfill your bureaucratic requirements. Why is it that the localization agenda is not happening? We're not seeing it on the ground. Why are we talking about such tiny, tiny percentages going directly to local organizations? If it's possible in Syria, and I know that you guys are doing fantastic work supporting local organizations in Syria, why is it not possible elsewhere? And, sorry, finally, I think that the long-term interests of private sector organizations don't necessarily align with the interests of local organizations. I really valued so much of what you said, Heba, but we know that in situations where there's instability, where there's conflict, a lot of huge corporations have a history of coming in and making market changes which displace the local economies and displace local businesses, change the laws around intellectual property rights, use their influence that they're gaining to change the economic structure and make sure that they're absorbing possible customers. So I feel that I understand what you're saying, but I'm a little bit uneasy about it as well. I think I've covered most of what
That's
I
fantastic.
had.
Thank you so much for those comments. And I think I want to say those perspectives came through as well in the research that we were doing for the paper. And I think the way you put it is right. We're 7-ish years now into the Syria crisis. Goodness, South Sudan, we're several decades in. And still, we have a system that is largely impenetrable to people who don't speak the lingua franca of international humanitarian response. I want to.
But Jeremy,
maybe just a quick. I also want to make sure we hear from everyone there. But if it's just a.
You go first then.
Yeah, just super quick, and thank you so much for those points. I remember when I was a country director a bit more than a decade ago in Ethiopia, when the USAID Forward sort of initiative, which I think was to get 20% of the entirety of USAID's budget out through local partners within us. I can't remember what the time frame was, and clearly it hasn't worked, even though it was a publicly stated, big, bold initiative under US. And I think in part the system, as you've sort of been alluding to, the default bias is the skill set, which is not local knowledge, contextual understanding. It's donor language, it's donor reporting, it's understanding donor requirements. So somehow the system, the prioritization of skill sets and capacities needs to be radically changed if things like AID Forward are ever going to come to fruition.
Yeah.
I'll just make two very, very quick points.
Can we bring a mic to him while you're making that?
I want to address the private sector point because you and Nasser both raised it. I'm not advocating for the private sector to take over humanitarian response. What I am saying is they're doing it anyway. And you might as well recognize that that's happening and then see where it makes sense to encourage that, where you'd like to influence them in different directions. But there was a survey by Edelman recently that found that I think it was 85% of employees were looking to their employers to make social change, not to their governments, let alone the UN. So they are a player regardless, and it's then how do the others react to that? And then on language and the localization agenda, just one thing that emerged from our year of reporting on locally led humanitarian responses was there's like a really simple thing you could do to change some of the power balance and ease a lot of the deep frustration that I don't think people in New York and Geneva realize how deeply held those frustrations are, which is name those local actors. And I was amazed at the response that we were getting to simply naming the names of these organizations and these individuals in our stories and recognizing that they exist and representing them and giving them some visibility. And that's a really easy thing that international NGOs can do when they're doing their press releases to take the credit away from themselves and give it to their partners.
In the back?
So my name is Ben Smilowitz. I'm with the nonprofit Disaster Accountability Project, and we're a small independent watchdog in the space, started after Katrina. And we launched a platform called Smart Response, which I'll mention. But just to back up the comments from the representative of the Syrian organization, I don't think the localization efforts by the international community are credible. I think that they're pathetic, and I think that the fact that local organizations still can't be found after decades of capacity building initiatives, they don't have websites. Their websites don't, local organizations are so hard to be found that donors can't find them. And so when they want to get direct funding, it's almost impossible for donors to think that they're credible and to find enough information about them to support them. Even private donors that are more flexible than big nation donors that have all sorts of reporting requirements. Even individual donors can't find these local organizations, and despite all this capacity building, which baffles me. So what I'd like to see, and what we've been putting all of our effort into, is the Smart Response platform that allows local organizations to register for free, share data on themselves, almost like a common grant application. And then when a disaster happens, we can curate localized how to help lists so that donors can connect directly with the local NGOs and bypass the international NGO community. And in that situation, if local organizations are able to access direct support without needing international NGOs to handhold them, I call it putting them on a leash, but without the international NGOs handholding or being in an intermediary, which is often like a 6-stop layover for cash when it goes from here to any country, even Haiti. 6-stop layover. It takes like 2 years for that money to get there, and only a small percentage actually ends up showing up because of the number of layovers that money takes at intermediaries. Then local organizations can choose who they want their partners to be. And if they don't have the capacity to actually implement the programs that they want, and some do and some don't, then they can choose who the most respectful international NGOs are and decide, we don't want this organization anymore, and we want this one. And giving them the agency to make those decisions, I think, is what the localization agenda is all about. And the comment by Jamila before about how these national NGOs are popping up all over the world. Like this, for example, CARE, was it Save the Children or CARE had an announcement? I think CARE had an announcement in Indonesia just a few weeks ago, and they changed their name. Instead of CARE Indonesia, it's a locally sounding name. So people think that it's a local NGO, but it's totally not. And they invited all the local NGO community to come celebrate with them, and they came. And I'm like, that they're just going to screw you. Like to the other local NGOs.
So this is a debate that Jamila and I have been having a bit lately of whether whether in fact it's a bad thing and for local organizations, or for rather international organizations, to begin turning control over to local boards, local leadership. And I think there are different views on that. I'm less certain than you are that that's going to result in local civil society being screwed. I think it's potentially international groups handing the reins of power over to local management, local leadership.
No.
It depends on the see, this is where we disagree. Patty, I think you were trying to, you had a hand up, and then we'll go here.
So I'm Patty McElreevy with Interaction. Well, there's so much at this conversation that's incredible. I do think one thing that's really important to remember is the narcissism of our small differences, and we seem to really be very focused on a lot of them, and looking for. You started off by talking about we're all looking to blame the one right above us for the power imbalance, and then. Sorry, but a lot of the comments here have been doing that exact thing, and the practice we've called out from the very beginning. And let's stop looking at who the closest is to us and how to blame, and look at the bigger issue. First off and foremost, from the Grand Bargain, from Kristalina Georgieva's leadership on humanitarian financing, we know the pot is too small. It's only 2.5 Halloweens. That's how big the humanitarian appeal is at the moment globally. 2.5 Halloweens in America. That's crazy. If you put it in those kind of perspectives, how we can't afford to have more money go into the system and thus more sharing of what's needed. There's plenty for many and all of us to be doing. We need to be a lot more effective. We need to be a lot more efficient. But, first and foremost, I want to call that out. I really want to highlight
it's actually, Patty, a brilliant idea for a fundraising campaign. Just get every American family to donate an equivalent amount to some humanitarian organization.
Instead of buying costumes and candy that they're going to.
It's actually genius.
Yeah. So I think definitely, just as long as I get credit, no, I'm just kidding. I think we're not talking enough about seeding power and building trust. And we're all looking to who, but a lot of the comments seem to be who is responsible for the situation I'm in? I actually agree with a lot of the comments that have been made here today. We do need to have a lot more local languages being utilized. Translators Without Borders has done an enormous amount of work on this. But guess what? They're an international NGO. So if we're going to hate all things international, we got a problem there. So we got to look at how we are trying to help each other. There are some components of the UN that really need severe reform. There's some components that are working well. So we need to be more honest about where are the challenges? What are the issues? International NGOs, there are some, yes, who are very bad partners and maybe always will be. There are others who are trying to be very good partners, but there are things beyond the donor community which is impacting us. Counterterrorism regulations, OIG, Office of Inspector General regulations. These are all hindering partnership agreements. We can challenge international NGOs and the UN to be better partners, but we don't necessarily have control over the funding coming through us or not. Right. So one choice may be, yes, we won't take the funding, but guess what? It's a lot more than 6 levels to get to you now as a national organization. It's no levels. These organizations, these political components are something we need to work on together and we need to address together. So I just wanted to ask one question to you guys, on the nexus. Because I've now, in the last year, been to Ethiopia, Nigeria, Afghanistan. It's all nexus all the time. Yet I can't figure out what it means. I can't have anyone, and no one in countries ever been able to explain it to me. And I fear that there's a retrenchment occurring as a result of it. And I'd like to get your thoughts on this because a lot of it comes down to power and money. Where is the development agenda? How is the government owning it? Yet the places we're piloting it are often places that have political challenges internally. And these populations have been underdeveloped or are underreached for reasons beyond the control of the government or actually purposely by the government. Yet we're using a language of response that actually reinforces an imbalance, and from my recent visit to Afghanistan, pushes the humanitarians further and further into 2 decades ago, not even new reform, old humanitarians being embraced there, quick truck and chuck and done and handed over to development actors who aren't there for many reasons. So how do we actually start to look at this beyond the humanitarian response, but into where we want to go as a sector overall and having stronger connectivity development? So I was just wondering if you could talk about that a little.
And we have about 20 minutes left, and I want to give you guys all a chance to kind of have a final word. So why don't we take a few more comments, and then I'll just turn it over to to the panel for a final word. So here, and then Zahar.
Christine Mendoza with Humans on the Move. I'm also co-chair for the working group for Nexus Global Youth, Refugee and Forced Displacement. Over the last month, so we work with a network of 6,000 people globally, 4,000 of which are next generation philanthropists. And two of their biggest challenges are, one, they think funders themselves are siloed. And so they're looking like these next gens really want to be pushing the envelope at with local solutions, with maybe even supporting larger NGOs, but they want to do it collaboratively, and so they're trying to find partners to work with. And so existing funders in the space, whether they're state actors or even the private foundations, are hard to find collaboration partners. And then the other challenge that was consistently brought up is that the reporting on best practices. So whether if you're an organization and you said, hey, look, we are a children-focused organization and we have found this really works around early childhood education, it takes 18 months for that report to get out. You're talking to a generation who has one of these, who has access to information at very rapid speed. The humanitarian sector needs to speed up its ability to communicate what's working and what's not. So.
Thank you. Zahar.
Adam Carroll with Justice for All. We're a small NGO, a human rights NGO, and want to kind of speak on behalf of our partners who are Rohingya and Uyghur and from Kashmir. Obviously, in those situations, those are persecuted communities. The governments are not allowing access to the UN. That's one issue. But for the places where there is access, for example, the refugee camps in Bangladesh, I was wondering if someone might want to comment on the situation there related to the conversation that's been going on this afternoon. From our perspective, I mean, we see that refugees are not counted as refugees. Education is severely neglected. They are not consulted in many important decisions, and they're treated as consumers rather than citizens. And so, we have a crisis that develops out of that, a crisis of trust, values, and communication. So when groups like Gates Foundation offer and plan to give an award to Prime Minister Modi, who is notorious for his human rights abuses, and we have the head of UNICEF, and we have the Deputy Secretary General attending that this week. That's a crisis of values, and it erodes confidence around the world. So I wonder, human rights and humanitarian work have to go together, have to be complementary.
And I think an important point there too, that these things do not happen in a vacuum, and people are going to factor all this into their perception. Zahar.
Thank you very much for the discussion. I just want to reinforce what has been said. I'm originally Syrian American, and I think Syrian NGOs, and there is a lot of Syrian humanitarian who are well known and who have voices in the highest policy levels. At the same time, if I ask you or ask any of us, name one Rohingya person or NGO, probably most of us will not be able to name even one person, even that we have 1.3 million Rohingya refugees. The question that I have, we started a new organization called MedGlobal 3 years ago, branched out of the Syrian crisis, trying to apply some of the principles that we've learned in Syria and different parts of the world. We're gearing up to have our 4th mission in Yemen. And if I ask you what is going on from the health sector in Yemen, you're probably going to say cholera and malnutrition. But that's not the case that we discovered. What's really hurting the Yemeni people right now is chronic diseases. The fact that they want to have a training in regional anesthesia, reconstruction surgery, and helping babies breathe. So that's what we are gearing up for the next mission. If we want to do things right, as a new organization that is trying really to partner with local organization and improve resilience in these communities, not from the fact that we know how to do things, but we really want to partner with you as local organization. How can we do it? I mean, there were a lot of theories that were discussed here, but if we want to do tangible things, so we can really listen to the local communities and they can participate in the power and also in the decision making. How can we do it in this world?
Yeah. Greg?
Greg Gottlieb with Tufts University, formerly where Jeremy sat. I think one of the challenges that donors have is that their money is very split. Patty, you brought up the notion of nexus, and the fact is that those two buckets, they don't cross. And I think one of the challenges that the NGOs have is, and somebody here mentioned it, you have a hard time raising money for core costs. Actually, even from the donor side, it's a hard time for donors to fund core costs. Yeah. And also, oftentimes when a disaster ends or emergency ends, the money drifts away. So the challenge, I think, which has been in place for years for whether it's OFDA or any other donor, is the money goes for the response. It does not go for the longer term building up of the system. And I think that's one of the things that really has to change. But to your point, it is not, at least from the U.S. side, it is not an easy change on the Hill. It is not an easy change to make because that's not how people view humanitarian assistance. They will look at it and say, that's development, that's the other guys. And those are the other guys that aren't that interested in it.
All right, I think we have time for probably two more. So maybe here and then Jim. Here. There.
Thank you. I just wanted to touch a bit on the financing dilemma that's been pointed out by a lot of people. Sorry, I'm Ramya Gopal, and I lead innovation and innovative financing for IFRC. So I work with Dr. Jamila. I mean, one is about the financing gap. But also about how financing can be used more effectively. So we recently designed an outcome-based blended finance model that acts as a collateral for a bond issuance. The idea behind it was to exactly ensure this effectiveness, which is how can donors get more leverage out of their contributions? How can philanthropists get greater, well-assured and well-defined outcomes? And how can investors only bother about credit risk so that you actually have scalability in the model? And you think it's a no-brainer because this kind of an outcome-based model also forces implementation agencies like us to have greater accountability in how we do our work. But we recognize that we seem to assume a rationality in the financing world that doesn't necessarily exist. There's almost a reluctance to go for a complex model of financing, which actually benefits everybody, ensures greater efficiency across the board, simply because it's more complex. And I think maybe the exception is just DFID, who are far more advanced in the payment by results and outcome funding models. But we're recognizing that it's almost an education where we have to take all our donor partners along with us, because what seems like good common business sense doesn't necessarily seem to fly, just because it seems more complex than just giving regular grants. Right? So I just want to raise it. Thank you.
Great. And Jimmy.
Yeah, I'm Jimmy Colker, a former U.S. diplomat, became a global health person at UNICEF and then the Obama administration. But you asked the question, who has too much power here? And I just give a couple thoughts on that. One is, it seems to me clear that the people worried about the force protection, the security of, for instance, U.S. government and other government personnel have way too much power. And we're seeing that because CDC and USAID personnel are not able to go to Butembo and Beni and Eastern Congo because it's a conflict area. No one's able to go to Yemen because it's a conflict area. The result is this imbalance of risk that you talked about and many people reinforced of who's actually doing what in Yemen or in South Sudan or in other places where there really are risks to so many of the humanitarian crises are in conflict areas. And I think we've got way out of proportion to where the risk avoidance in terms of the response is being decided. And these people are heroes who go in there, but we don't have the same, if a U.S. soldier is killed in Afghanistan, he or she is a hero. If someone is killed in Eastern Congo, that's a bureaucratic mistake, and somebody needs to be...
Or like 9 months of congressional hearings.
Yes, right. So that's one. The second, from my UNICEF experiences, I'm wondering if the cluster system doesn't have too much power in at least this way, that UNICEF, humanitarian disasters are a fundraising engine for UNICEF, and it's commoditized. A school in a box, give $50 and there'll be a school in the box. Give $10 and you can help 20 kids get rehydration solutions and so on. And the fine print says we might not spend it on this after all, but the sense that the humanitarian response is driven by the donors, that the contract is to the donors, and that these branded products are what humanitarian response is about, does seem to me are driven by the responsibility under the cluster system, and a little bit about how the funds are actually contributed. So child protection, for instance, it's almost impossible to get UNICEF money from mail or, monthly donors for child protection.
You can't stick it in a box and...
Right, and often that is, the vulnerability of young girls, for instance, in a humanitarian situation is very real, but it's hard to get a money or a program or a commodity that's going to actually respond.
That's a great point. So I would like to, we've got a lot to cover and a lot to respond to, and rather than try to do every last thing, what I'd like to do is ask each of you on the panel to respond to one of the questions that's been put forward, and then react to one of the suggestions that was made, and just think which of the suggestions that you've heard here today do you think has the most potential to meaningfully shift power and shift behavior. And I'm happy to go with whoever's ready to address that, or I can, Simon, go for it.
I'm happy to take the Nexus one, Patty, because I think that's a huge step forward for us as a community. One of my immense frustrations for many years has been the kind of linear siloing or the segmentation out of humanitarian and development. So that's been an ongoing frustration, and in today's world where the World Bank and who counts them, who knows, but 2 billion people living in states of protracted fragility and violence. It's the burning issue of our time to address those root causes of that fragility. We kind of frame that around 3 Gs, addressing grievances, so sort of social cohesion work, governance, and so that could be in DRC, kind of forming a public-private partnership or a new way to work within the water sector, and then sustainable, equitable economic growth. And that's where all the partnerships come in with the private sector. And all that, that touches to pretty much all of what we've been talking about for the last couple of hours, stepping out of your boxes, working across sectors, partnering in different ways, and then de-risking and pushing those partnerships into those most fragile places. And so I think the more our donors and all of us become aligned around that as a priority and a way of working, call it a nexus or call it whatever, but fundamentally we're talking about a more efficient, effective way to address the root causes of what's driving such horrendous levels of humanitarian need. So that's great and hugely important. Of course, the challenge around that is how do you communicate it? And then you get to the sort of trust side. If Edelman were here, they would say, I think there was a tiny uptick in the trust barometer for NGOs this year, but we're still under 50% will trust NGOs. So how do you communicate in a different way in order to restore and build that trust? That goes to the point of putting the voice or giving voice to others so that they can communicate more authentically the realities in these contexts and communicate it in a more coherent and compelling way, so simplifying the complex. And if we can simplify the complexity around a nexus and how we collaborate within it, that gives me great hope.
And so what's the most impactful
Jeremy,
option for you? I'm not going to let you off the hook, Sam. Even thinking about what you just talked about moving towards a sort of de-siloed way.
I think, hey, look, I'll put it out. I think it's back almost where I started, and that seems a bit cheeky to go back to myself, but it's about me, it's about I, not the we. It's not about, it's about the power in all of us and recognition that it's a power shift from us to others. And Patty, to come back to you, I think you sort of said that we're all including myself, pointing at others and saying that's what needs to change. We fundamentally need to be more aware of the power that we hold and be more prepared to give some of that power up.
I look forward to Mercy Corps championing that.
Hold us accountable. Hold us accountable.
I'll do that.
Same place.
It's on the live stream. We've got it.
Heba, you will.
Heba.
You will.
I will try to tackle Nick and, well, they were kind of related points from Nick and Greg, as I see them, which is that the challenge that you face as donors to bring your people along on that journey, I think there is a role for us in the media, and that's part of the problem in the sense that media coverage of humanitarian crises has been caught up as one of the victims of the wider challenge and crisis that the media is facing today in terms of the business model, in terms of trust in the media. But, and we are now one of very few, we're the only outlet that really is dedicated to covering humanitarian crises, but also one of the few that is doing so in any consistent way. But I think that can be part of the answer in terms of being able to explain these issues to the public, not just keeping attention on them as you referenced in terms of the attention coming and going, but why is cash programming better? So when you get this kind of pushback from the Daily Mail saying, okay, now our money is going to the terrorists, et cetera, you know, to have a credible and informed voice, be able to say, well, actually, here are the facts, as much as facts matter these days. So that's one piece. I think the other piece in terms of media is a lot of the donors that are struggling to figure out how to move forward on this have at least recognized that there are ways in which they can incentivize the accountability side of the equation. So we get funding from government donors, humanitarian aid departments, because they realize that they can legislate holding themselves accountable by funding an independent media, which
That's why I wouldn't fund you.
Which you rightly said would be very difficult to get through the hill, but in fact many countries have succeeded in saying we have pledged publicly in the Grand Bargain and elsewhere to hold ourselves accountable. How do we make that a reality? How do we actually systematize that letting go of power? And one of the ways of doing that is ensuring that there are independent voices that will call you out when it needs to happen. So I think there's a piece there that is perhaps an easier win in creating an ecosystem that encourages this kind of dialogue. And then in terms of kind of the one thing that I think is most impactful, you know, we are a nonprofit newsroom that sees itself as putting journalism in the service of the most vulnerable people on earth. We hold on to that mission very closely. I think if every organization that has a mission that is linked to serving people in need every day asks itself, what is it? Is it putting that mission first? We'd go a long way. So when Simon is willing to say, actually, maybe Mercy Corps should shrink or merge because that would be in the interest of the affected people, I think that's, you know, what we see in our reporting every day is that institutions are getting so caught up in growth and funding and visibility that they have lost track of what they were originally set out to do. And if we can just kind of keep bringing that back into focus as events like this are trying to do, I think that would be.
And that's a governance issue as well, because that's not just about an NGO CEO saying, okay, we're going to get smaller, but in service of our mission. They need to have their board on board with that as well. And you know, similarly with the big UN organizations, it's a matter of the governing bodies endorsing a new and different vision of what those organizations might need to be in the future. Jamila, final words.
First of all, I just want to say to you, thank you for raising that. And I want to also assure you that in all the localization meetings we've had, we've particularly focused on women's groups. I think you know this, right? And that we actually have pre-consultation with women's groups. And I can give you one result of that is in Nigeria, in the consultation. Now, recently, they've had OCHA has taken it upon themselves, and good for OCHA, to actually organize among women leaders, women civil society leaders, you know, how they can help in their leadership development and also for them to gain access to information and so forth. So I'm an incurable optimist. Otherwise, I wouldn't be in this business, right? 20 years ago, or 20 over years ago when I started, this conversation would never have happened. All right, so this conversation is now happening for the first time in the last few years. The word localization, you can take it in different ways that you mean it, but at least someone's talking about local organizations. I think we are reaching a tipping point. And I think, you know, it will change. Things will change, whether we like it or not, and it will change. And my advice is local organizations themselves need to organize themselves. Even if I was a donor, I'd be really quite confused. There are thousands of local organizations, so who do I fund? So just as we are saying the international community should get their act together and, you know, form coalitions, local organizations need to do the same and figure out, you know, what is best practice, what is good practice, and so forth. So innovation is also required. So I really like what you've done with the platform. I think that's how we get to people, because everyone has a cell phone, all right? And then to Patty, absolutely, we've had this conversation. This is not about us versus them, you versus me. It's about what is the collective outcome we want to see. And we've been saying this over and over again since we started with the summit, to say, can we look at, you know, why do we have to wait for a crisis to happen? We have enough information, evidence, experience to already categorize crises in different ways, that if you have this kind of complex situation, here's the minimum outcome that you want to see, and then who's going to be able to do that? Now, for disasters that are, you know, as a result of hazards and shocks, surely the international community must find itself out of this situation. And not play a role, because, you know, if Indonesia is calling out that it doesn't want international action, and to be honest, when you talk to the Indonesian government, they say it wasn't even a very large tsunami, but I think it was the emotive, you know, it's the tsunami itself has such an emotional reaction that everybody wants to go, but because they've had to incinerate millions of dollars worth of drugs because they were either expired or from in languages they couldn't even understand, the government said enough. We're not going to go through that again, right? So maybe for a start, if you want, let's be pragmatic. Disasters as a result of natural hazards and so forth, let the local Red Cross, let the local organizations, local government, and so forth take leadership. The problem will be in the conflict areas and the complex disasters, or the protracted ones. Then what roles are there for different actors? And the last thing I want to say is that on the development funding, we have to hold the people who have financial, the development funds accountable. How can they go on with, you know, UNDP and others who are meant to be development actors? How do we hold them accountable to build civil society capacities where there is none? You know, why is it that we spend billions of dollars in humanitarian response and we're doing the same thing over and over again? It's Groundhog Day, right? I mean, it's like, you know, we're not strengthening organizations. I have data that will shock you. I have data of a UN agency that has programmed $900 million in 1 year through our Red Cross societies and using 2.4 million volunteers. Those societies are no stronger. So now as a federation, we're saying to some of the UN agencies, stop. You want to look at capacity development, we look at it from the lens of the national society, and we'll do this together. You don't do it on your own. They're not subcontracted to you, right? But it requires leadership. And I think this is where the investment in leadership in local actors is important. And I think we have to think through who is going to do this. I don't think it's the UN alone. I don't think it's the Red Cross. It has to be you as local actors standing up, being strong, and demanding from us what you actually need. And, you know, and I really believe that women's organizations, you know, can show the way.
And with that, I think we are at time. Thank you so much, all of you, for joining us today and for your fantastic comments. And thank you to the panel. And please grab a snack on your way out.